What kind of man becomes the richest in the world without ever lifting a weapon? John D. Rockefeller didn't just build wealth. He built something bigger than money, an empire. But before the billion-dollar empire came 1839, and a childhood born into poverty that most wouldn't survive. This is the story of a billionaire who rose from nothing and left a mark on history. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in the remote farming town of Richford, New York. The Rockefellers weren't poor by charity standards, but they were nowhere near comfort. Their wooden home was small and drafty, surrounded by open land and unpaved roads. Food was earned with labor, not bought in abundance. Every item in the house had been mended, saved, or reused. From his earliest days, John watched his family stretch what little they had to cover what they needed. Childhood was not a time for dreaming, it was a time for adapting. Work was introduced early. By the time John could carry a pail, he was expected to contribute. He helped stack firewood, fetch water, and clean up around the house without complaint. His chores weren't just lessons. They were his role in the survival of the household. There was no reward system, no praise for doing what was expected. Discipline came naturally to him, not because he was born with it, but because life made it a requirement. There was no space for idleness in that kind of environment. The outside world didn't offer much contrast. Richford was quiet, plain, and largely isolated. Few opportunities came through, and fewer stayed. Children in towns like this didn't imagine skyscrapers or fortune. They imagined enough food for winter and a good harvest come spring. Still, something about John's nature was different. He watched more than he spoke. He kept things inside, thoughts, goals, worries, and studied how the world moved around him. Religion was the loudest voice in the home, even louder than his father's laughter or his mother's footsteps. His family was Baptist, and church attendance was not optional. Scripture was quoted often, and obedience was framed as both virtue and survival. That religious foundation would remain with him all his life, not just as belief, but as structure. It gave him a sense of moral scaffolding in a world that otherwise felt unstable. That same sense of instability would soon expand beyond their farmhouse walls. The Rockefellers began to move again and again, chasing new beginnings and escaping old problems. Each move reset friendships, schools, and surroundings. But for John, those changes didn't mean starting over. They meant studying how to stay steady when everything else changed. That mindset would later become one of his greatest strengths. Eliza Davison Rockefeller was quiet, serious, and unwavering. She held the family together when her husband didn't, and she did it without complaint or applause. Her faith wasn't a choice. It was the center of her existence. She believed that hard work was sacred, thrift was a virtue, and God's approval mattered more than public opinion. Every dollar spent had to be justified, and every action weighed against eternal consequence. She didn't demand love from her children. She demanded obedience, honesty, and discipline. And in John, those demands took root. She was not soft, but she was deeply dependable. When Bill was gone, sometimes for weeks, Eliza didn't collapse or wait for rescue. She kept the household functioning with or without him. She cooked, mended, taught, and held firm to her rules. No one questioned her authority, including John. From her, he learned that quiet control could be more effective than noise. Her way wasn't flashy, but it never failed. Eliza taught her children how to save, how to resist impulse, and how to stay upright in a world built to knock them down. John learned to track his earnings, to divide them properly, and to give a portion to the church no matter how small the total. She made financial responsibility feel like a moral obligation. Every cent had a purpose. That belief, that money must be controlled, not spent, stayed with him for the rest of his life. John admired her with the intensity of someone who understood her sacrifices. He once said he owed everything to his mother, but their relationship was never warm or casual. She wasn't the type to offer hugs or soft words. She gave stability, expectations, and rules, things John would one day mirror in his own empire. Through her, he also developed an appreciation for consistency. She never let chaos dictate her actions. She followed the same habits day after day, even when the world around her unraveled. That emotional steadiness became a template for John. Proof that power didn't always have to be loud. It could also be quiet, constant, and unshakable. If Eliza taught John how to endure, Bill taught him how the world really worked. William Bill Rockefeller was charming, reckless, and unpredictable. He sold miracle cures that healed nothing, promised deals he wouldn't honor, and vanished whenever responsibility called. He lived by his own rules, and he bent them for sport. He had other women, other families, other lies. He wasn't a provider, he was a performer, but he made an impression. Bill wasn't dumb. He understood how to read people, how to manipulate desire, and how to walk into a room with confidence that covered his guilt. He showed his children how to use charm as a tool, and how to win, even when playing dirty. When he gave John advice, it wasn't biblical. It was strategic. Always get the better end of the deal, he told him. That lesson stuck longer than any sermon. To a young John, Bill's behavior was both frightening and fascinating. He saw how his father twisted truth into profit, how he made people trust him even when they shouldn't. That level of persuasion intrigued him. John didn't approve of it, but he studied it. There was value in understanding how power could be taken, not just earned. The contradiction between Bill and Eliza didn't confuse him. It sharpened him. From his father, he absorbed lessons in negotiation, persuasion, and boldness. But he never forgot the damage those traits could do when left unchecked. That contrast shaped how he would later wield his own authority. He would be strategic like Bill, but never uncontrolled. Even years later, when he'd built an empire, John rarely spoke of his father. Bill reappeared occasionally in his life, asking for money or trying to benefit from his son's success. But John had already learned the most important lesson Bill could ever teach. Power without discipline is dangerous. He would never let that be his story. The Rockefellers moved so often that stability became a myth. Each new town brought different people, different churches, and a fresh chance to pretend the past hadn't followed them. These weren't moves of ambition. They were escapes from consequence. Bill would leave a trail of deception, and the family would quietly slip away. Eliza made each house feel consistent, but John knew better. Change was constant, and he responded by building patterns within himself. He found comfort in routines, keeping records, performing chores, repeating habits. These gave him a sense of control. They weren't rituals of survival. They were tools for sanity. He couldn't stop the family from moving, but he could predict how he would behave each time. That kind of emotional structure became his secret weapon. When life was unpredictable, he chose to be the opposite. By the time they arrived in Cleveland, John was already developing a mindset that would guide his future. He didn't attach easily. He didn't complain. He watched, he adjusted, he noted what others missed. These weren't survival instincts. They were management skills being formed in childhood. Each new city was another case study in how to function when everything else was moving. This wasn't resilience. It was calculation. He wasn't just enduring, he was preparing. He didn't dream of wealth the way most children did. He dreamed of steadiness, of a life he could arrange on his own terms. Each relocation confirmed one truth. If he ever wanted security, he would have to build it himself, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, and in time, he would. But those early years, full of motion, disappointment, and silence, would become the blueprint. John would go on to design an empire with that same logic. Eliminate uncertainty, reduce chaos, control everything possible. Because if he didn't, who would? John's relationship with money began as a moral responsibility, not a desire for wealth. From a young age, he kept a small ledger, writing down every cent he earned and spent. It wasn't about hoarding, it was about accountability. He saw money not as a measure of status, but of discipline. Each coin was a decision, and decisions in his world revealed character. Eliza taught him to tithe 10% to the church. This was non-negotiable. Whether he made $1 or a dime, a portion went to God. It trained him to treat income seriously, even small amounts. There were no casual earnings. Every job, every task, every penny was recorded and reflected on. It was part bookkeeping, part self-discipline, and part sacred habit. That mindset grew stronger over time. He began tracking what others overlooked: costs, waste, value. He noticed patterns. He found satisfaction not in spending, but in structuring. It gave him a sense of control over his future. By his teens, he was already lending small sums to neighbors and charging fair but firm interest. The boy who had once counted pennies was becoming a financier. He dressed simply, lived modestly, and worked tirelessly. He didn't believe in flaunting what he had. To him, wealth was a result, not a personality. And he never forgot the connection between faith and finances. Giving, saving, and growing were all part of the same ethical formula. John D. Rockefeller was not shaped by a single parent, but by the tension between two opposing forces. His mother taught him to live by scripture. His father taught him to survive without it. Eliza believed in principles, Bill believed in opportunity, and John, without knowing it, absorbed both. He didn't see contradiction, he saw balance. That balance became the core of his future success. He didn't reject either parent. Instead, he borrowed from both. From Eliza, he gained structure, faith, and patience. From Bill, he learned negotiation, timing, and advantage. It was a rare combination, and it gave him an edge that neither parent had on their own. In the business world, that duality became his greatest weapon. He believed in giving, but only after securing. He believed in honesty, but understood leverage. He gave generously, but always with calculation. These weren't moral failings, they were adaptations. He found a way to merge righteousness with results. That merge made him nearly impossible to match. Throughout his life, that inner balance stayed with him. He could pray with sincerity in the morning, then execute a cutthroat business strategy by noon. Some called it hypocrisy. He called it stewardship. He believed God had chosen him to create wealth, and it was his job to manage that calling with both conviction and competence. That dual legacy, his mother's iron spine and his father's flexible will, was never forgotten. He didn't speak of it often. He didn't need to, because every choice he made, every empire he built, and every rival he outmaneuvered carried the signature of two people who never agreed on much, except that their son was meant to lead. In 1853, the Rockefellers moved again, this time to Cleveland, Ohio. But unlike the small towns before it, Cleveland felt like something different. Ships lined the Cuyahoga River. Railroad tracks cut through the city like veins. The energy was sharp, electric, filled with people chasing something bigger than survival. For 14-year-old John, it was a revelation. This wasn't just another stop on the map. This was a place where you could build a life from scratch and maybe never have to leave again. John's eyes lit up the first time he saw the city's shipping docks. He didn't speak about it much, but he felt something shift inside him. Watching merchants exchange goods, warehouse clerks bark out orders, and ledgers pass between hands. He understood this was a world where numbers had power, and behind those numbers were decisions. Cleveland wasn't just full of buildings, it was full of possibility, and John could feel himself leaning into it. At home, not much had changed. Money was still tight. Meals were still simple. But John's focus wasn't on what they lacked. It was on what could be done differently. He began studying how people ran businesses, how goods moved through the city, how success seemed to favor those who prepared more than they talked. It wasn't that he dreamed of being rich. It's that he started asking himself serious questions, ones most teenagers never considered. His church life remained intact. Every Sunday, his family sat in the pews, listening to sermons that warned against vanity and praised perseverance. John listened closely, but while others nodded and moved on, he began applying those lessons to real life. Not in theory, in practice. If hard work pleased God, then he would work harder than anyone. If honesty mattered, then he would keep his promises better than the rest. His faith wasn't separate from his ambition. It walked beside it. By the time John turned 15, he wasn't the same boy who'd once trailed behind his mother or sat silently at dinner. He'd grown steadier, more deliberate. He asked sharper questions. He kept longer hours. He stopped waiting for direction and started giving himself one. Cleveland didn't just offer a better home, it offered clarity, and John was ready to claim it. At 16, John took a risk that most boys his age never thought about. He dressed in his best shirt, packed his confidence, and began knocking on office doors downtown, asking for work. He wasn't hoping for favors. He was looking for someone who'd see his value before he had a resume to prove it. After several rejections, a commission house named Hewitt and Tuttle took a chance. They hired him as an assistant bookkeeper, and that's where everything started to change. His tasks were straightforward: logging transactions, calculating freight costs, and keeping track of supply shipments. It was routine work, but John approached it with full attention. He double-checked every number. He asked for clarification when he wasn't sure. And he kept quiet when there was nothing useful to say. Within weeks, his employers began to trust him with more responsibilities, not because of his age, but because he rarely made the same mistake twice. He earned 50 cents a day, and he treated every coin like it mattered. When payday came, he didn't celebrate. He recorded it, saved most of it, set aside a portion for the church, and kept the rest for emergencies. His coworkers laughed sometimes, said he was too serious. But John didn't care. He had no interest in proving anything to them. He was there to learn, and he took every task as a stepping stone. The more he worked, the more he saw how decisions shaped outcomes. Why one supplier succeeded while another failed. Why some expenses grew quietly, unnoticed, until they swallowed profits. He started to understand that real intelligence in business wasn't loud. It was careful, focused, always paying attention to details others missed. These weren't things he read in books. These were lessons that came hour by hour, week by week. That first job may have seemed small to outsiders, but it gave John a foundation nothing else could. He didn't just gain skills, he earned self-belief. For the first time, he saw what could happen when someone took their responsibilities seriously and stayed consistent. He'd never forget that, not in his personal life, and never in business. One evening, after another long day of numbers and ledgers, John took out his journal and wrote something no one else was ever meant to see. "I will be worth $100,000. It wasn't a boast. It wasn't for show. It was a private promise. He had no idea how he would reach that amount, but he knew this much. If it could be earned, he would find the way to earn it. For a teenager living in a rented home, it was a declaration with teeth. He didn't pin that number on a wall. He didn't tell anyone. But he treated it as a personal assignment. Everything he did from then on, every transaction, every decision, was measured against that goal. He didn't work just to get through the day. He worked to close the distance between where he stood and the figure he had written. In a world where people often talked big and acted small, John chose the reverse. His life became organized not by chance, but by intention. His workspace stayed clean. His records were always updated. If he said he'd arrive at 7 a.m., he'd be there by 6:50. If he borrowed something, it was returned in better shape than he found it. He didn't need to be reminded to do the right thing. He'd already decided that the way he did the little things would reflect the way he did everything else. He didn't see money as luck. He saw it as a measure of reliability. If he followed through, worked hard, and avoided the traps of carelessness, then, over time, the results would show. That belief shaped his behavior. Not just at work, but in the way he carried himself, the way he handled conversations, the way he chose when to speak and when to listen. The $100,000 goal stayed private for years, but it was never forgotten. And while most people who made such claims did so with flair or noise, John never once repeated it. He didn't need to, because he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to become someone. As the months passed, John began to stand out. Not because of anything dramatic, but because of his consistency. He showed up early, he stayed late. He didn't cut corners or make excuses. If something needed fixing, he fixed it. If he made an error, he owned it. There was no flash about him, no need to draw attention. Yet people noticed, because dependability, it turns out, has a gravity of its own. Colleagues started to mention him in quiet admiration. "The boy doesn't speak unless he has something to say," one said, "but when he does, it's worth hearing." Another called him a man of habit, meaning it as both praise and mystery. Even his employers began giving him tasks they wouldn't trust to older staff. In an industry full of talkers, John had become a doer, and he never asked for thanks. Outside of work, his life followed a quiet rhythm. Church on Sundays, Bible reading at night, walks through the city during his free hours. He didn't chase distractions. He didn't waste time proving his worth in public. His faith shaped his values, but not in a loud or judgmental way. He believed that success should follow character, not the other way around. Even in stressful situations, John rarely lost his composure. If numbers didn't line up, he looked again. If a delivery went missing, he found out why. His calmness wasn't rehearsed, it was real. People who worked with him said he had a presence, even as a teenager. Not because he demanded attention, but because he didn't seem shaken by the chaos that flustered others. By age 17, he had built something few young men ever manage: a reputation. Not one based on talk, flash, or charm, but on results. His name was beginning to carry quiet weight in Cleveland's business circles. And the most powerful part? He still felt like he was just getting started. By 1870, John D. Rockefeller was done playing small. He had seen the future, and it wasn't grain, it wasn't hay, and it wasn't scattered deals in dark offices. It was oil. He had already invested in refining and had proven that order could beat chaos in the industry. But now, he wanted something bigger, something with permanence, something with reach. So, at the age of 31, he and a few trusted partners incorporated Standard Oil Company of Ohio. It wasn't just a business name, it was a blueprint for domination. Cleveland was already crowded with refineries, over 30 of them, all operating in disarray. Most of them leaked money, wasted product, and worked on guesswork more than logic. Rockefeller's strategy was different. He didn't want the biggest refinery, he wanted the best run one. He wanted consistency, scale, and total control, from raw crude to final product. And he understood that to build something lasting, he had to first eliminate waste and unpredictability. Standard Oil began with a clear vision and a small circle of loyal men. Alongside partners like Henry Flagler and Samuel Andrews, Rockefeller brought precision to a business that had never seen it before. They purchased better equipment. They measured output down to the barrel. They negotiated smarter shipping deals and ran longer hours. While other firms celebrated small profits, Rockefeller reinvested every extra dollar into growing more efficient. He wasn't building a business to survive. He was building one to outlive its founders. His leadership style was quiet, firm, and exacting. He didn't raise his voice or make grand speeches. He asked questions others overlooked and noticed problems others ignored. He demanded accountability from his team and gave it in return. Standard Oil didn't explode onto the scene. It crept forward with steady force, outpacing and outlasting its local competitors. And soon, Cleveland was no longer a battleground. It was Rockefeller's home field. From the outside, Standard Oil looked like a well-run refinery. But on the inside, it was the beginning of something much larger. Rockefeller was building not just an oil company, but an empire of infrastructure, influence, and strategy. And while his rivals were watching one piece of the puzzle, he was already designing the entire board. One of the first things Rockefeller realized was that true efficiency didn't stop at the refinery door. If he wanted to lower costs and increase reliability, he had to own the tools of transportation too. So he began buying the things others rented: barrels, rail cars, and storage tanks. He didn't want to depend on outsiders for what he could do better himself. Every container, every wheel, every valve, he wanted it under his company's control. He introduced strict methods for reducing waste in every part of the process. Scrap metal was reused. Fuel byproducts were repurposed. Even the sludge at the bottom of storage tanks was processed to extract usable kerosene. Rockefeller believed that waste was the enemy of growth. His employees were trained to watch every measurement, every leak, every shift in output. The goal wasn't just profit, it was refinement in the truest sense of the word. Standard Oil began manufacturing its own barrels. Then it acquired its own fleet of railroad tank cars. From there, it negotiated exclusive access to pipelines and storage facilities. This wasn't just expansion, it was vertical integration. He didn't want to rely on outside suppliers who set their own prices. He wanted to control every step from crude delivery to final sale. In time, the company could move oil cheaper and faster than anyone else in the country. To outsiders, this level of detail seemed obsessive, but inside Standard Oil, it was just normal. Schedules were kept, machinery was inspected regularly. Everything had a system. Rockefeller's focus on efficiency didn't just reduce costs. It created a culture. People who worked for him either rose to meet that standard or didn't last long. There was no room for carelessness in a business moving thousands of barrels a day. This obsession paid off. Standard Oil's refined kerosene cost less, burned cleaner, and reached markets faster than its competitors. Customers didn't care who ran the company. They just liked the product. But behind the scenes, that success was built one tiny improvement at a time. And John D. Rockefeller knew every one of them. By the early 1870s, Rockefeller had another insight. Transportation wasn't just an expense, it was leverage. Railroads were the arteries of American commerce, and oil needed to move long distances to reach urban markets. Most refiners paid a standard rate to ship their barrels, but Rockefeller saw an opportunity to rewrite that deal. Quietly, he approached major rail lines with a proposition. Give Standard Oil discounted rates, and in return, guarantee them consistent, high-volume shipments. The railroads agreed. They liked the idea of predictable income from a trusted client. What they didn't publicize was the additional favor. Standard Oil not only received rebates on its own shipments, but also a portion of the rates paid by its competitors. In effect, Rockefeller was being paid by the railroads to move his own oil, and to penalize his rivals at the same time. It was legal at the time, but it was secret, and it was devastatingly effective. These deals gave Standard Oil an enormous advantage. Where competitors struggled to break even, Rockefeller's company saved huge amounts on transportation costs. That meant he could sell at lower prices, squeeze margins, and still make a profit. Customers had no idea why his prices were better, they just knew they were. And competitors couldn't keep up. Many either went bankrupt or were quietly bought out. Within a few years, Standard Oil's grip on the Cleveland oil market tightened. Other refiners called foul, but they had no proof of the deals happening behind closed doors. And Rockefeller wasn't talking. To him, these negotiations were just smart business. If the system allowed it, he'd use it. If the rules were unclear, he'd define them by action. These secret rebates marked a turning point. Rockefeller had proven that he wasn't just efficient, he was strategic. He understood that influence wasn't always about making noise. Sometimes it was about securing the quiet advantage no one else saw coming. In 1872, Rockefeller and a small group of powerful oil men formed an alliance with several major railroad companies. The group was called the South Improvement Company. On paper, it looked like a business association aimed at stabilizing the volatile oil market. But in reality, it was a calculated strategy to lock out competitors and tighten Rockefeller's grip on the industry. Through this arrangement, Standard Oil would receive exclusive shipping rebates and confidential intelligence on rival shipments. The deal meant that for every barrel of oil a competitor shipped, Rockefeller's company would know when, where, and how much. And in some cases, he'd profit directly from his competitors' costs. It was control at a new level, not just of logistics, but of knowledge. With this insight, Standard Oil could predict market behavior and undercut rivals before they even knew they were being targeted. The South Improvement Company wasn't just a backdoor advantage, it was a weapon. But it didn't stay quiet for long. Independent refiners in Pennsylvania and Cleveland caught wind of the agreement, and outrage exploded. They called it a conspiracy, because that's exactly what it was. Meetings were held, protesters marched, newspaper headlines labeled it a betrayal of fair trade. Small refiners united under one banner and refused to do business with the South Improvement Group. Some even smashed barrels and blocked shipments in protest. The backlash was swift and fierce. Politicians got involved. State legislatures denounced the arrangement. Within weeks, the South Improvement Company collapsed under public pressure. The railroads withdrew. The agreement was canceled. It looked like a defeat for Rockefeller, but only on the surface. While the deal itself had failed, the damage had already been done. Standard Oil had used the brief window of advantage to gain market position, strike critical deals, and deepen its infrastructure. Rockefeller never publicly apologized for the plan. Privately, he shrugged it off as a necessary risk. He believed that industry, not sentiment, should determine what was fair. In his mind, the market wasn't a battlefield, it was a chessboard. And if others refused to think 10 moves ahead, that wasn't his problem. The South Improvement scandal revealed something bigger. Standard Oil wasn't just a business, it was a strategy unfolding in real time. After the collapse of the South Improvement deal, Standard Oil's reputation began to shift. People in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia started asking the same quiet question. Who is this Rockefeller? Customers knew the name. So did competitors. But few knew how deeply his company had already embedded itself into the national oil supply chain. While others were busy reacting to the scandal, Rockefeller kept acquiring, consolidating, and expanding. Behind closed doors, he moved swiftly. He bought out struggling refineries, sometimes with cash, sometimes with pressure. In many cases, owners accepted his offers because they knew they couldn't compete. His terms were strict, but fair. If they joined him, they survived. If they resisted, they'd be priced into extinction. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't issue threats. He simply made the numbers impossible to ignore. By the end of 1872, Standard Oil controlled nearly 1/4 of the oil refining capacity in the United States. That was more than just market share. It was dominance. Reporters began digging. Competitors whispered about secret deals and unfair advantages. Some called him brilliant. Others called him dangerous. But the truth was clear. Something new was taking shape in American business. And John D. Rockefeller was behind it. The term monopoly hadn't yet entered legal vocabulary the way it would later. But the unease had begun. People weren't just upset about the prices, they were afraid of the silence. Standard Oil didn't advertise loudly, it didn't brag, it just expanded. Steadily, quietly, with a confidence that suggested it knew where things were headed before anyone else did. Still, Rockefeller didn't flinch. He believed that what mattered wasn't how people felt, but how systems worked. If he could make oil cheaper, cleaner, and more available, then public sentiment would follow in time. In his view, trust wasn't earned with words, it was built through performance. And he intended for Standard Oil to outperform everyone. John D. Rockefeller once summarized his approach in 6 cold words. We don't compete, we absorb. It wasn't arrogance, it was policy. He didn't believe in fighting every rival on open ground. He believed in building a system so complete, so efficient, that resistance became impractical. Standard Oil wasn't at war with competitors, it was simply outgrowing them. By 1874, the company had purchased or crushed most refineries in Cleveland. The city, once crowded with independent operators, was now a Standard Oil stronghold. From there, Rockefeller expanded outward to Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York. In each city, he used the same methods: identify weaknesses, offer solutions, secure control. He didn't destroy his rivals with violence. He offered buyouts, partnerships, or price wars that they couldn't win. If they agreed to sell, they walked away rich. If they didn't, they walked away empty. Either way, he took their market. What made Standard Oil different wasn't just its size, it was its structure. Rockefeller created a centralized, highly coordinated organization where decisions could be made quickly. Data was monitored continuously, and every part of the process was aligned. It functioned more like a machine than a traditional business. In an era of scattered operations and family-run chaos, it felt revolutionary. And it was. Lawmakers began to take notice. Some applauded his innovation. Others warned of unchecked influence. But Rockefeller was careful. He stayed out of the public eye, rarely gave interviews, let his company's results speak for themselves. And in doing so, he became something unusual in American capitalism: a powerful man almost entirely without a public voice. By the mid-1870s, Standard Oil was no longer just a company. It was a force reshaping how industries were run. The age of scattered competition was ending. The era of centralized power had begun. And at the center of it all stood a man who saw the long game and never blinked. By the early 1880s, Standard Oil had grown from a Cleveland refinery into something far more expansive. John D. Rockefeller now oversaw a network of operations stretching across the United States. Every major oil-producing region, from Pennsylvania to Ohio to New York, reported numbers that fed back to a single headquarters. And those numbers told one story: Rockefeller was winning. By 1882, Standard Oil refined over 90% of all oil in the country, a scale unmatched in American industry. That dominance wasn't just about size, it was about precision. While his competitors were still using scattered records and handshake agreements, Standard Oil had departments, audits, and efficiency reports. Profits weren't left to chance. Every margin was tracked, every facility was accountable. This wasn't expansion through chaos, it was expansion by design. And the results were too obvious to ignore. Across the industry, Rockefeller's name became a dividing line. There were those who worked with him, and those who were trying to survive without him. Refineries that didn't sell to Standard were either undercut in price or acquired outright. Many simply closed their doors. This wasn't loud conquest. It was a slow, tightening grip. And by the mid-1880s, there were few places left in the oil world where his shadow didn't reach. What began as a local company had now become a national force. Standard Oil didn't just move products, it moved markets. And its founder, still avoiding public attention, had become the most powerful businessman in America. But Rockefeller wasn't finished. He believed in total integration, and that meant controlling more than oil alone. Controlling oil meant more than refining it. Rockefeller knew that owning the supply line was just as important as owning the product. So Standard Oil began absorbing every layer of the infrastructure: tank cars, shipping routes, pipelines, and even storage terminals. If it touched oil, he wanted it. He didn't want to rely on outsiders who could change terms or raise prices. He wanted certainty, from the well to the lamp. One of his key moves was in rail transportation. Standard Oil built and operated its own fleet of tank cars, ensuring steady delivery regardless of rail politics or delays. Then came the pipelines, miles of steel veins that bypassed railroads entirely, linking wells to refineries and ports without interruption. Where others saw logistical headaches, Rockefeller saw opportunity to streamline. His pipelines didn't just move oil, they moved control. Beyond land, he looked to the water. Standard Oil took ownership of key ports, loading docks, and coastal facilities. This allowed the company to manage exports directly, cutting out the middlemen entirely. In every direction, he tightened his grip. If you wanted oil shipped, refined, stored, or sold at scale, you had to go through him. The structure he created didn't just run efficiently, it eliminated competition by default. These weren't public acquisitions. There were no parades or speeches. These were calculated, quiet investments made behind closed doors. But the impact was enormous. In a matter of years, Rockefeller turned Standard Oil into a self-contained organism, one that could outprice, outdeliver, and outlast any rival in the world. And it wasn't just growing, it was evolving. By 1882, Rockefeller faced a new challenge, not from the market, but from the law. State regulations limited how much a single company could operate across borders. Standard Oil had outgrown Ohio. It needed a structure that could keep expanding while staying legally invisible. The answer was the Standard Oil Trust, an innovation that would change the way corporations operated in America. The trust was a legal instrument, not a traditional company. It allowed various entities, refineries, transport services, pipeline operators, to be held under a single management board. Each unit retained its own name but answered to the same central authority. On paper, they were separate businesses. In practice, they were one. And at the top of it all sat Rockefeller and his inner circle, making every major decision. This structure gave Standard Oil the flexibility to operate in multiple states without triggering legal barriers. It also allowed Rockefeller to control dozens of operations without owning them outright. It was clever, it was complex, and it was almost invisible to the public. By the time regulators caught on, the trust had already cemented its position. Competitors couldn't replicate it. Lawmakers didn't know how to confront it. The trust became a model for other industries: steel, sugar, tobacco. But Rockefeller's was the first, and it was the most effective. He didn't need flashy titles or overt authority. Through the trust, he managed an empire quietly and efficiently, with limited oversight and maximum reach. It wasn't just about making money, it was about building an organizational structure that no storm could shake. Rockefeller didn't see rivals as enemies. He saw them as inefficiencies to be corrected. If a refinery was profitable but poorly run, he made an offer. If it refused, he waited. If prices needed to drop to encourage a sale, he dropped them. It wasn't personal, it was math. He wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. He was trying to build something cleaner, faster, and more reliable than the chaos he saw around him. Many refiners took the offer. They walked away with money in hand and their pride intact. Others resisted, and those who resisted often found themselves squeezed out by lower prices, tighter supply chains, or shrinking customer bases. It wasn't illegal, it was leverage. Rockefeller didn't threaten, he didn't shout, he just made it harder to stay in business unless you joined him. There were stories, some whispered, some published, about how quiet the takeovers were. Employees would show up to work and find a new owner. Delivery routes would suddenly change hands. Storage tanks once marked independent now bore Standard Oil labels. The company's dominance wasn't built with drama. It was built with patience and relentless momentum. By the late 1880s, very few independent refineries remained. Those who did clung to small markets and low margins, hoping the giant wouldn't notice them. But Rockefeller noticed everything. He believed that the fewer moving pieces outside his control, the smoother his machine would run. And in the end, most competitors either joined him or disappeared. The more power Rockefeller gained, the more the public began to sense something strange. There were no large signs bearing his name, no speeches, no public persona. Yet his company's reach was everywhere. Factories, rail lines, shipping ports. The silent empire, as some journalists began to call it, moved without fanfare but carried unmistakable weight. People began to whisper about his methods. How could one man control so much without anyone fully understanding how it worked? Why were prices lower near Standard Oil facilities? But competition always seemed to vanish. The company's success created unease. It was admired, yes, but it was also feared because it was quiet, too quiet. Reporters tried to learn more, but information was hard to find. Executives rarely spoke on the record. Documents were protected. Internal decisions remained private. Even shareholders often had little insight into the daily workings of the company. Rockefeller had created a new kind of influence, one that operated without spectacle, and the absence of noise only made the company feel more powerful. What made the silence so effective was its contrast. In an era of booming factories and shouting salesmen, Standard Oil spoke with actions. While other businesses bragged, Rockefeller executed, and the less people heard from him, the more they talked about him. The mystery around the man and the company became part of the brand. A brand built on trust, fear, and results. Despite becoming the most dominant businessman in America, John D. Rockefeller avoided the spotlight. He rarely gave interviews. He didn't lecture or pose for portraits. He didn't throw grand parties or chase recognition. In fact, most Americans wouldn't have recognized him if they passed him on the street. That was intentional. He believed his power came from what he built, not from how loudly he talked about it. While politicians and tycoons engaged in public battles, Rockefeller worked from behind the curtain. He let his company's numbers speak louder than his voice ever could. When criticism came, he said little. When praise arrived, he deflected. He understood something few leaders did. Visibility can be a weakness, and for him, it was a risk he didn't need to take. His quiet presence gave him an edge. Competitors never knew what he was planning. Journalists never knew what he was thinking. And the public, while suspicious, could never quite pin him down. That ambiguity protected him. It allowed Standard Oil to grow without drawing too much legal attention, at least for a time. Rockefeller's silence wasn't shyness. It was discipline. He wasn't trying to be admired, he was trying to win. And in business, he saw talk as a distraction from the work. To him, real leadership didn't need a stage, it needed results, and by that measure, he was unmatched. In 1904, a journalist named Ida Minerva Tarbell released a book that would shake the foundations of American industry. The history of the Standard Oil Company wasn't a dry economic manual. It was a gripping, detailed, and fiercely researched account of how Rockefeller had built his empire. Not just through vision, but through strategy that bordered on sabotage. Tarbell didn't rely on rumors. She used court records, testimonies, business documents, and first-hand accounts. And she had a personal reason to dig deep. Her father had been one of the independent oil producers crushed by Standard Oil years earlier. Tarbell's book didn't just tell a story, it exposed a pattern. She described how Standard Oil had manipulated railroads, forced buyouts, and punished competitors who resisted. She named names, traced timelines, quoted letters. The tone was factual, not emotional, but the evidence was damning. The book didn't shout, it presented. And in doing so, it made it hard for anyone to look away. The public reaction was immediate. Readers across the country couldn't believe how much one company had controlled, and how quietly it had done so. The image of Rockefeller as a generous businessman began to crumble. In his place emerged a figure more complex, brilliant, calculating, and perhaps dangerously powerful. For many, this wasn't just a business story, it was a moral reckoning. Tarbell's work turned Rockefeller into something he had long avoided, a public target. He had spent decades building an empire behind closed doors. But now, those doors were open, and the country was looking inside. Well, he didn't respond directly to her accusations. He didn't give interviews or publish statements. But the days of quiet dominance were over. The nation had questions, and they wanted answers. Tarbell's book arrived at a time when Americans were already uneasy about growing corporate power. Cities were changing, small businesses were disappearing, and the word trust no longer sounded like a good thing. The media picked up where Tarbell left off. Editorials demanded accountability. Cartoons portrayed Rockefeller as an octopus, its tentacles strangling the economy. Overnight, the private man became a public villain. Politicians couldn't ignore the momentum. Presidential candidates began criticizing monopolies in campaign speeches. Reformers in Congress called for stronger laws and deeper investigations. Antitrust became a political rallying cry. The people wanted action, and the message was clear. No company, no matter how successful, should be above the rules. Standard Oil, once seen as a model of business success, was now the symbol of unchecked greed. Business owners who had long feared Rockefeller's methods began speaking up. Some shared stories of forced sales. Others revealed secret deals they'd once kept quiet out of fear. Competitors who had been swallowed up or pushed aside felt vindicated. Tarbell had given them a voice, and the growing backlash gave them courage. The silence that had protected Rockefeller's rise was breaking apart. In town halls and newspaper columns, the question shifted from "how did he do it?" to "should he have been allowed to?" It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about fairness, about power, and about whether one man or one company should ever hold so much influence over an entire industry. The pressure was building, and it wasn't going away. In 1890, years before Tarbell's exposé, the US government had passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law designed to limit monopolies and promote competition. But for more than a decade, it had been rarely enforced. That changed in the early 1900s. Fueled by public outrage and political pressure, the government began targeting trusts that had grown too large. And at the top of the list stood Standard Oil. The Department of Justice launched a full-scale investigation. Attorneys combed through thousands of pages of business records. They tracked the web of companies held under the Standard Oil Trust and found what they believed to be clear evidence of monopolistic practices. This wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about law. And for the first time, Rockefeller's empire faced a threat it couldn't simply absorb. Standard Oil's lawyers argued that the company had lowered prices, improved efficiency, and served the public. They claimed that success, not coercion, had built the business. But the government wasn't interested in profit margins. It was focused on structure, on the control the company held over pricing, transportation, and supply. The case wasn't about whether Standard Oil worked. It was about whether anyone else had been allowed to. The trial played out over several years, gathering attention from all corners of the country. Economists testified, executives were called to the stand, and all the while, Rockefeller remained largely silent. He was no longer the active day-to-day leader of the company, but his influence remained clear. His name hovered over every courtroom session, even if he never stepped inside. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States delivered its decision. Standard Oil was to be broken up. The court ruled that the company had engaged in unreasonable restraint of trade under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The trust would be dismantled into 34 separate companies, each required to operate independently. It was one of the most significant rulings in the history of American business. The judgment wasn't a suggestion, it was a mandate. The massive machine Rockefeller had built over decades would now be split into smaller, disconnected entities. Control would be diluted. Central leadership dissolved. The business press called it the end of an era. Politicians hailed it as a victory for free enterprise. Reformers celebrated it as proof that no one was untouchable. The ruling sent a message far beyond the oil industry. It signaled to steel, railroads, and finance that the government was ready to enforce limits. The age of silent monopolies had met its first major defeat. Standard Oil, once admired for its efficiency, was now held up as an example of excess. The courtroom had succeeded where competitors had failed. But while the structure was being dismantled, something unexpected happened. The market didn't collapse. Investors didn't flee. In fact, the value of Standard Oil stock began to rise. And the man at the center of it all? He didn't protest. He didn't panic. He watched quietly, as if he had been prepared for this all along. John D. Rockefeller responded to the breakup in a way no one expected. with calm and quiet confidence. He didn't appear devastated. He didn't call it unfair. In fact, when a reporter asked him for a comment, he simply smiled and said, "Buy Standard Oil stock." He wasn't joking. He understood something others didn't. The pieces of his company weren't weaker on their own. They were individually valuable. Each of the 34 new companies retained assets, leadership, and operational strength. Some handled refining, others focused on transportation or retail. In the years that followed, many of these so-called baby standards would grow into giants themselves. Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco. The breakup hadn't destroyed the business. It had scattered seeds, and each one took root. Rockefeller owned stock in every new entity. So as they began to perform, his personal fortune didn't shrink. It surged. Shares he had once valued collectively were now rising independently. In the end, the government had split his empire, but it had also multiplied his wealth. It was a twist no one predicted, and one that made the antitrust victory feel strangely incomplete. Public critics were stunned. Reformers who had cheered the ruling now watched Rockefeller become the first billionaire in American history. His control had been broken, yes, but his influence had not, and his legacy as a builder of systems, not just companies, remained intact. The court had dismantled Standard Oil's structure, but Rockefeller had already secured something stronger: ownership of its future. There's a strange irony at the heart of Rockefeller's story. The very thing meant to end his dominance, government intervention, ended up magnifying his wealth. In trying to break his empire, the courts had unwittingly diversified it. Where once there was one massive company, now there were dozens of thriving businesses, all tied back to one man's stock portfolio. His critics had pushed for punishment. What they delivered was scale. To the public, it seemed almost unfair. How could the most powerful businessman in the country be punished by making him richer? But that was the nature of what Rockefeller had built. It wasn't just a company. It was a design that could survive cuts, adapt to change, and emerge even stronger when fragmented. The breakup didn't expose his failure. It revealed the depth of his planning. Rockefeller never gloated. He didn't go on record celebrating his newfound wealth. Instead, he focused on giving: hospitals, universities, medical research. Now in retirement, he had the means to reshape more than just industries. He could reshape entire sectors of society. And whether you admired him or despised him, it was impossible to deny that he had changed the American landscape. The fall of Standard Oil wasn't a collapse. It was a transformation. The company disappeared, but its parts flourished. The monopoly ended, but the legacy expanded. And John D. Rockefeller, silent through it all, walked away wealthier than ever. Because for him, the real empire was never just oil, it was foresight. By the dawn of the 20th century, John D. Rockefeller had reshaped American business. But now, he set his sights on something larger than profit. He retired from daily operations in 1897, stepping away from the machine he had built. But he wasn't slowing down. In fact, he was just shifting gears. For him, retirement didn't mean leisure, it meant legacy. Rockefeller believed deeply that the vast fortune he'd accumulated had a divine purpose. And now, with the same rigor he once used to consolidate oil refineries, he would give it away. His first act of monumental giving was perhaps the boldest, establishing the University of Chicago in 1890. In a city still reeling from labor violence and rapid industrialization, he planted an institution of learning, science, and human progress. He poured over $35 million into it, determined to make it one of the finest centers of education in the world. It wasn't charity, it was a mission. From curriculum design to faculty recruitment, Rockefeller demanded excellence and longevity. He believed that knowledge could outlive wealth, and this school would prove it. But his commitment wasn't limited to prestige projects. He wanted to uplift the communities long overlooked by the American elite. One of the most meaningful relationships he cultivated was with Spelman Seminary, later Spelman College, a school for black women in Atlanta. Named after his wife, Laura Spelman, and her abolitionist parents, this act wasn't just about money, it was about justice. At a time when segregation choked opportunity, Rockefeller's donation helped hundreds of young women access education that had long been denied to them. In his quiet, methodical way, he was rewriting the rules of social capital. Throughout this period, Rockefeller kept a detailed journal of his giving, just as he had once counted every dollar earned. He approached generosity with the same discipline he had used in business. Every grant, every endowment had to be measurable and purposeful. He wasn't interested in feel-good gestures, he wanted outcomes, eradicating hookworm in the American South, funding revolutionary medical research, modernizing hospitals. The Rockefeller name began appearing not just in bank ledgers, but in clinics, laboratories, and classrooms. What set him apart wasn't just how much he gave, it was how he gave. Philanthropy became his new business model, and the results were staggering. By 1913, he established the Rockefeller Foundation, committing $100 million to tackle global health, education, and poverty. In many ways, it was the prototype for modern philanthropic empires. The foundation worked to eliminate diseases like yellow fever and malaria across the globe. Where oil had brought him power, these projects gave him something else: moral purpose. As his fortune grew, so too did his devotion to the Bible. Rockefeller never separated his wealth from his faith. Instead, he saw them as intertwined. He believed that God had given him riches for a reason, to steward them wisely and redistribute them faithfully. He tithed regularly, gave to his Baptist church generously, and surrounded himself with ministers, theologians, and advisors. But to the public, this pious image raised a difficult question. Was it humility or image repair? To Rockefeller, the answer was simple. "The good Lord gave me the money," he said. Whether that was said with gratitude or as a deflection, depends on who you ask. Some saw a man trying to give back after decades of ruthless conquest. Others saw a man whose spiritual beliefs had always guided his choices, even when those choices made enemies. Either way, religion was not a tool for Rockefeller. It was his compass. He prayed before meetings, quoted scripture in letters, and maintained a moral routine as disciplined as any business habit. But even in retirement, the shadows of his past loomed. Investigative journalists still hounded him. Protesters gathered outside his estates. Cartoons mocked his wealth and power. But Rockefeller rarely responded. His silence was strategic. He believed the best defense was to build something too big, too meaningful to ignore. He continued to fund libraries, theological schools, health campaigns, and agricultural research. If the public couldn't forget his business tactics, maybe they'd remember his impact. Privately, his family saw a different man. A grandfather who played golf daily, handed out dimes to children, and signed birthday cards with Bible verses. He grew fond of simple pleasures, music, nature, gardening. For the man who once counted every barrel, now it was roses he counted instead. And yet, even then, he watched the stock prices of Standard Oil's fragments with quiet satisfaction. His name had left the boardroom, but not the balance sheet. The moral debate about Rockefeller only intensified. Was his giving a form of repentance? Or was it simply the next stage in his design for influence? Whatever the motivation, the results were real. Millions received vaccines, scholarships, books, and medical care. Nations benefited from programs funded by a man whose empire once threatened their markets. In an era where businessmen were often condemned as greedy, Rockefeller became something else entirely, a symbol of what could happen when greed found a conscience. By 1916, the scale of Rockefeller's wealth defied imagination. For the first time in recorded history, a human being reached a net worth of $1 billion. That year, the press officially labeled him the richest man alive. To put it in perspective, his fortune represented more than 2% of the entire US economy. And yet, the man himself remained elusive. He rarely spoke to reporters, he avoided the spotlight. And while critics questioned how anyone could hold that much, others marveled at the size of the mountain he had climbed. He lived long enough to watch the world change. 2 world wars, the crash of Wall Street, and the rise of new industrial powers. Through it all, he remained a constant, like a relic from another age. While others panicked during the Great Depression, Rockefeller stayed calm. "I always tried to turn every disaster into an opportunity," he once said. And he had. The breakup of Standard Oil had birthed Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, each now a titan in its own right. Ironically, the antitrust ruling that was meant to humble him had made him even wealthier. In his final years, Rockefeller became almost mythic. He gave away dimes to strangers. He was featured in newsreels as a symbol of American prosperity. Children knew his name before they knew their presidents. He outlived his wife, many of his peers, and even his harshest critics. By the time he died in 1937, at the age of 97, he had given away over $500 million, a staggering figure by any standard, even today. Yet, despite all the headlines, there was still a quietness to his end. No final speech, no triumphant farewell, just a long walk into history. But Rockefeller's story didn't stop with his death. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., carried forward the family name, overseeing projects like the reconstruction of Colonial Williamsburg and the construction of Rockefeller Center in New York. His grandson, Nelson Rockefeller, would go on to become Vice President of the United States. And the foundation bearing the family name still funds global research and humanitarian work to this day. The dynasty endured, long past oil, long past monopoly, long past one man's ambition. The debate over Rockefeller's legacy still stirs today. Was he a cold-blooded capitalist who suffocated free markets? Or a visionary who proved that wealth, when channeled correctly, could uplift millions? Perhaps he was both. His life remains one of the great contradictions in American history. One man, born in poverty, who used discipline and strategy to climb to unimaginable wealth, only to spend the second half of his life giving it away. Love him or loathe him, John D. Rockefeller changed the world, and in doing so, became a mirror for the very system he helped build.